Welcome, traveler of stories. Tonight we journey back to the ancient world of Greece, to the timeless song of Homer, the Iliad. Here you will hear of heroes and battles, of gods and grief, of Achilles, Hector, and the sorrow that shaped the fate of Troy. Find your rest. Tell me, where are you in the world? And what is the time there? And let the epic begin. Sing, O Muse, of the wrath of Achilles, son of Peleus, the terrible anger that brought endless grief upon the Achaeans, that hurled the souls of countless warriors down to the dim halls of Hades and left their bodies unburied, the prey of dogs and carrion birds. Thus was fulfilled the will of Zeus. The tale does not begin with triumph, but with a quarrel between Agamemnon, king of men, and Achilles, swift of foot. And from that quarrel sprang the sorrows of nations. For 10 long years the Achaeans had lingered upon the shores of Troy, their black-hulled ships, drawn up in long rows upon the sand, seemed like a second city beside the sea. Their masts rose like a forest of bare, weathered trees. Their ropes creaked with the ceaseless breathing of the wind, and their prows pointed forever toward the high walls of Ilium, as if in constant challenge. Day after day they fought upon the plain, where bronze flashed beneath the pitiless sun and dust rose thick around the hooves of horses. Night after night they lit their fires, the glow of 1,000 flames mirrored in the restless waves. Men dreamed of home, of wives and children far across the sea. Yet the walls of Troy still stood, proud and patient, and the war dragged on like a wound that refused to close. Weariness pressed upon the host. Heroes had fallen, their names already turning into mournful songs. And the younger men who filled their places carried the burden of years without glory. Some longed only for the return voyage, to feel the soil of Greece beneath their feet once more. But an oath bound them, the solemn vow made long ago, when Helen had been stolen from Sparta. They had sworn to defend her honor, to stand with Menelaus, and to bring her back, no matter the cost. Oaths hold men longer than desire, and so they endured. Then came the day when Chryses, the priest of Apollo, walked into the Greek camp. He was an old man, his back bent with age, his hands heavy with garlands and ribbons sacred to the god he served. His staff gleamed in the sunlight, bound with fillets of white, and upon his shoulders hung the weight of grief. For his daughter, Chryseis, had been taken as a prize by Agamemnon, lord of men. Chryses approached the assembled warriors, his voice trembling yet strong with the authority of a father and a servant of the god. "Great sons of Greece," he cried, "may the gods grant you victory and safe return. But hear my plea. Accept these gifts, these ransom offerings of gold and silver, and return to me my daughter. Spare her from captivity, and spare yourselves the anger of Apollo, the god of the silver bow." The men murmured among themselves. Many nodded, for they pitied the priest and feared the wrath of his god. They would have persuaded Agamemnon to grant the request. But Agamemnon's pride was a mountain that no counsel could move. He rose from his seat, eyes flashing, and his words fell like thunder. "Old man," he said, "do not linger near my ships. I will not release the girl. She is mine, and in my halls she shall serve me far from her home. Be gone, and do not return, lest even your God fail to shield you from my anger." A hush fell upon the camp. Chryses trembled, not with fear, but with insult. He gathered his robes about him and turned away, walking slowly toward the sea. When he reached the shore, he lifted his hands to the sky and prayed. His voice broke with sorrow, but the words carried power, for they reached the ears of Apollo himself. "Hear me, O God of the silver bow," he cried. "If ever I have crowned your altars, if ever I have burned fat thigh bones of bulls and goats upon your holy fire, grant me this. Let the Greeks pay for my tears. Let your arrows bring plague upon their camp until they honor me and release my child, Apollo heard." From the peaks of Olympus he descended, his bow shining upon his shoulder, his quiver rattling with deadly shafts. His step was like night falling across the land. He came to the Greek camp and loosed his arrows. First he struck the mules and the swift hounds, then the men themselves. Fires burned with the bodies of the dead, day after day, until the smoke darkened the sky and despair gripped every heart. At last, the leaders gathered in council. The plague could not be endured. Calchas the seer rose trembling, for he knew what truth he must speak. "The god will not turn aside his anger," he declared, "until the girl is returned without ransom and sacrifice is made in honor of Apollo. Only then will the plague cease." The word stung Agamemnon like a whip. His pride rebelled, his voice rose in fury. "So it falls upon me to yield? Must the king be the only man denied his prize? If she must go, then so be it. But hear me, I shall take another, whether from Ajax or Odysseus, or even from Achilles himself, that all may know my power cannot be diminished." The assembly murmured in fear and anger. Then Achilles rose, blazing with wrath. "You shame yourself, Agamemnon," he cried. "You gorge upon the spoils of others and threaten to strip your own warriors of honor. You are not a king, but a devourer of men's toil. If you take what is mine, by the gods, you shall see how swiftly your pride brings ruin upon us all." The quarrel deepened, their voices clashing like bronze on bronze. The air seemed to tremble with the weight of their fury. Agamemnon called Achilles insolent, a soldier hungry only for glory. Achilles' hand went to the hilt of his sword, and the men gasped, fearing blood would be spilled in the very heart of the assembly. But then Athena descended, unseen by all but Achilles. She caught him by the hair and whispered in his ear, "Hold your hand, son of Peleus. Do not strike the king. Your time will come, and your honor shall be greater if you restrain your anger now." Achilles trembled with rage, his sword half drawn. At last he obeyed, thrusting it back into its sheath. But his words were sharper than steel. He swore that he would no longer fight for Agamemnon. "When Hector burns your ships," he cried, "then you will remember that you cast aside the best of the Achaeans." The quarrel left the assembly shaken. Men returned to their tents with heavy hearts, for they had seen their leaders divided, and in division lay ruin. The fires that night burned low, the murmurs of soldiers muted. Even the sea seemed to brood, its waves falling in dull rhythm against the shore. Above, the stars watched in silence, indifferent to the pride of kings. Agamemnon's anger did not cool. Though he had yielded the daughter of Chryses and appeased Apollo's wrath, his pride still bled from the wound Achilles' words had given him. He would not be shamed before the host. In his tent, he brooded like a lion robbed of prey. At last, he summoned 2 heralds, Talthybius and Eurybates, and gave them a cruel command. "Go to the hut of Achilles, son of Peleus," he said, "and bring me the girl Briseis, whom the army gave him as a prize. Let him feel what it is to stand against the king of men. Let all the host see that no man, however strong, may defy Agamemnon without cost." The heralds bowed their heads. They feared the errand, yet obedience bound them. They went in silence to the camp of the Myrmidons. There they found Achilles seated before his tent, the sea wind stirring his hair, his face dark with wrath. They dared not meet his eyes as they delivered the king's command. Achilles heard them, and a bitter laugh broke from him. "So it comes to this," he said. "The king sends not warriors, but messengers. For he fears to face me himself. Ace, take Briseis then. I will not stain my hands with the blood of heralds, who do no more than carry the words of their master. But tell him this, though he strips me of my prize, he cannot strip me of my strength. The day will come when he shall beg for me to save his ships, and I will not answer." Patroclus, faithful companion, led Briseis forth. She followed the heralds in silence, her eyes downcast. But as she passed Achilles, she touched his hand lightly, as if to leave behind a fragment of comfort. He did not speak, but his gaze lingered upon her until the tent flap fell. Then he rose and strode to the shore, where the waves broke white upon the sand. There he lifted his arms to the sea and cried out to his mother, Thetis, goddess of the deep. From the waters she rose, her silver feet glimmering, her veil of foam trailing behind her. She knelt beside him, brushing the tears from his face with hands cool as the tide. "Why do you weep, my child?" she asked. "Your heart burns hotter than the sun upon this shore." "Mother," Achilles said, "Agamemnon has dishonored me. He has taken Briseis from me, not for need but for pride. My honor is broken, my spirit torn. I will not fight for him again. If the Greeks perish, let them perish. Go to Zeus, ruler of gods and men. Beg him to give victory to the Trojans, that the Greeks may learn the cost of scorning Achilles." Thetis' heart ached, for she knew the fate awaiting her son. "Your years are short, my child," she whispered. "Glory and doom are twined around you like threads in a single cord. Yet I will do as you ask. I will climb Olympus and kneel before Zeus. I will remind him of the help I gave when the gods rose against him, and he will grant me this favor." She wrapped her arms around Achilles once more, then sank back into the sea, her form swallowed by the waves. Achilles stood upon the shore, gazing across the endless waters, his wrath silent but burning, as steady as the stars above. Meanwhile, the Trojans gathered heart. With Apollo's plague lifted, they sensed the favor of the gods, tilting toward them. Hector strode through their ranks, his voice carrying hope. "The Greeks are divided," he told them. "Their greatest warrior sits idle, consumed by anger. Now is the hour to press them. Let us drive them back to their ships and show them that Troy endures." And so the stage was set. Achilles withdrawn in wrath, Agamemnon stubborn in pride, the Greeks trembling without their champion, and the Trojans bold with newfound courage. The will of Zeus had been stirred, and no man could foresee how the tale would unfold, except that it would end in sorrow for kings and heroes alike. When dawn spread her rosy fingers across the horizon, Thetis rose from the sea. Her silver veil shimmered with drops of foam, and the nymphs of the deep swam in her wake as she ascended to the bright heights of Olympus. The halls of the gods shone like fire in the morning light, their columns carved from cloud and stone that no mortal hand could shape. Upon his throne of thunder sat Zeus, the son of Cronos, his brows shadowed with thought. Thetis approached with reverence, kneeling before him. She touched his knees and clasped his chin, as was the ancient custom of supplication. "Father Zeus," she said, her voice trembling with both humility and urgency, "you once owed me a debt, for I stood beside you when the other gods rose in rebellion. I called Briareus, the hundred-handed, and his might turned the tide. Because of me, you remained upon your throne. Now I beg repayment. Grant strength to the Trojans. Drive the Achaeans to their ships, that Agamemnon may taste the folly of dishonoring my son." Zeus sat in silence, the weight of eternity upon him. His eyes turned toward Hera, his wife, for he knew her heart burned for the Greeks. If he granted Thetis's plea, Hera's anger would rise like storm winds. Yet the request could not be dismissed, for the goddess spoke with a mother's grief, and behind her words lay the fate of Achilles, beloved of gods and men. At last Zeus nodded, a slow and heavy nod that made Olympus tremble. "It shall be as you ask," he said. "But know this, Hera will rail against me, and the strife of gods may match the strife of men. Still, my will is unshaken. I will tilt the scales toward Troy until the Greeks bow beneath their sorrow." Thetis bowed low, her heart torn between triumph and dread. She descended once more into the sea, her silver feet vanishing into foam, while Zeus sat brooding on his throne, the storm of destiny gathering beneath his gaze. Far below, upon the plain, the Trojans stirred with new courage. Hector armed himself, fitting his greaves and breastplate, fastening the plume upon his helm until it nodded like a crimson flame. He lifted his spear, long as a pine, tipped with bronze that gleamed in the sun. Around him his men shouted, the sound echoing against the walls of Troy. From the towers, women watched and wept, knowing each cheer might be their last glimpse of sons, brothers, or husbands. The Greeks, by contrast, felt unease seep into their ranks. Though they numbered many, though their leaders were mighty, they sensed the absence of Achilles as a void that none could fill. Diomedes tightened his grip on his spear. Ajax shifted his great shield upon his shoulder. Odysseus muttered strategies beneath his breath. But in each man's heart a shadow lingered. They looked often toward the silent tents of the Myrmidons, as if the very sight of Achilles might give them strength. But no figure came forth. Battle joined with the rising of the sun. Chariots rolled like thunder across the plain, wheels biting into dust, horses screaming with the thrill of war. The clash of bronze against bronze rang so loud it seemed to shake the sky. Spears flew, shields shattered, arrows hissed through the air like wasps. Men cried out in triumph and agony, their voices mingling into one terrible hymn. Yet the tide leaned steadily toward Troy. Each time a Greek gained ground, a sudden misstep or a stray arrow undid him. Each time a Trojan faltered, Hector appeared, fierce as fire, to rally them. It was as if unseen hands guided the struggle, and indeed it was so. For Zeus himself weighed the fates. His promise to Thetis bore fruit, and the Greeks were pressed back step by step. Within the city, Priam watched from the high tower. His old heart swelled with hope he had not dared to feel for years. "Perhaps," he whispered, "the gods remember us still." Beside him, Hecuba clasped her hands in prayer, while Andromache stood silent, her eyes fixed upon her husband's figure on the field. That night, when the battle paused and fires dotted the plain like fallen stars, the Greeks gathered in sorrow. Nestor, wise in years, rose to speak. His voice was soft, but carried weight. "You see now what pride has wrought. Without Achilles, We are broken reeds in the wind. Agamemnon, you must bend. Send gifts, send words of peace. Before all is lost, Agamemnon bowed his head, pride clashing with fear. At last he agreed. Let envoys go to Achilles. Let him have treasures, gold, tripods, horses, even Briseis returned untouched. Let him hear that I, Agamemnon, repent of my anger, so it was decided. Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, old and faithful, were chosen as envoys. They set out beneath the quiet of night, the sea murmuring beside them, their hearts heavy with hope and doubt. They came at last to the tent of Achilles, where firelight glowed and the sound of a lyre drifted softly into the night. Achilles sat within, his fingers moving upon the strings, his voice low as he sang of the deeds of heroes long gone. Patroclus sat beside him, listening, his face shadowed by worry. When the envoys entered, Achilles welcomed them with courtesy, for they were friends. Food and wine were set before them, as custom demanded. Only when the rites of hospitality were complete did Odysseus rise to speak. He spoke of Agamemnon's apology, of the treasures offered, of the honor to be restored. He begged Achilles to set aside his anger, to return to battle, for without him the Greeks would surely fall. Ajax added his voice, plain and direct, reminding Achilles of the comrades who fought and died each day. Finally, Phoenix, the old tutor who had raised him as a child, spoke with tears. He recalled the days of Achilles' youth, the lessons given, the hopes nurtured. His words were not of gold or glory, but of love. For a moment, silence held the tent. Achilles' face was lit by the flickering fire, his eyes unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice calm but cold. No gifts can heal dishonor. Agamemnon shamed me before all the host, and no treasure can cleanse that wound. I will not fight for him. Let the Greeks defend their ships without Achilles. When Hector sets fire to their hulls, then perhaps they will understand the cost of scorning me. Phoenix wept openly, but Achilles turned his gaze aside. Patroclus lowered his eyes, knowing the words would not be moved. At last the envoys departed, their footsteps heavy upon the sand, their hearts burdened with failure. And so the wrath of Achilles remained, unmoved, a storm gathering strength in silence. The envoys came back under a moon as thin as a clipped fingernail, their shadows long upon the sand. They had walked out together, buoyed by duty and a last small hope. They returned in a hush that needed no herald to translate it. Odysseus's eyes were dark and busy with thoughts that found no purchase. Ajax looked as if he would rather lift a wall than lift this news. Phoenix, old and faithful, wiped his face with the back of his hand, as a father does when words have failed a stubborn child. They entered Agamemnon's pavilion, laid down the garlanded cups, the unclaimed gifts, and the heavier burden of Achilles' refusal. Agamemnon listened with his scepter across his knees, like a bar of iron. He did not rage. Rage would have relieved him. Instead, a colder thing passed over his face, the realization that pride had become a trap he himself had baited. Around him the captains stood in an uneasy ring, Menelaus biting the inside of his cheek, Diomedes still as a set spear, Nestor stooped by the weight of years and of knowing. No one spoke first. A king can command, but he cannot conjure a bridge where a man has burned the river. At length, Nestor's voice threaded the silence. "We must survive this night," he said. "At dawn, post watch double on the rampart. Let men eat while there is bread, sleep while there is dark, and sharpen what must be sharp. The Trojans camp too near to our ships, and near is always the most dangerous distance. His counsel, simple as bread, went from mouth to mouth until it became orders. Torches were doused. Sentinels took their places upon the earthwork. The sea breathed steadily, the one thing in the camp that did not second-guess itself. Across the plain, Troy glowed like an ember cupped in two hands. Priam walked the wall walk with a staff that had learned his steps. He peered into the dark where the ships lay and murmured thanks to any god who would accept them. In the streets below, women filled jars and whispered their sons' names as if names were amulets. Children chased each other among the pillars, unafraid for one golden hour while fires were stoked and men told the kind of jokes that live only on the eve of danger. Andromache, hearing the cheer rise when Hector passed through the gate, put her fingers on the stone of the window and waited until the sound thinned and went away. Then she closed her eyes and taught herself not to listen for it again. Zeus, who had nodded once and so made all this so, watched without speaking. Hera's anger rode the air like dry lightning. Athena's gaze measured consequences the way a mason measures a plumb line. Poseidon muttered from his halls because he loved walls and ships and the men who learned to trust both. Yet the high will held. When gods are bound by their own gestures, mortals feel the knot. Dawn lifted out of the sea on pale wrists. The Trojans harnessed early, pavilions falling like withered flowers as ropes were pulled and stakes tugged free. Hector moved through the forming lines, not as a prince who demands, but as a man who gives his steadiness away by handfuls until a whole army stands upright on it. Polydamas, cautious as winter, urged restraint. Hold the ditch, count the shields, let the gods declare themselves twice. But courage, once warm, asks always to run. The chariots rattled forward, the drivers leaned, the horses' mouths foamed with the old knowledge of speed. The Greeks were ready enough to meet them. Ajax took the ground where ground is taken. Wide stance, shield high, voice even. Odysseus gathered men who had drifted and set them back like stones in a wall. Diomedes drove the point of his spear into the first charge, hard enough that the second rank thought better of it. Yet for every yard they clawed back, another slipped under their heels. Fate was a scale, and a thumb pressed upon it, and the name on that thumb was Zeus. By midday the fight snared itself along the ditch before the ships. Chariots skated and bit at the edge. Spearmen crowded the narrowings. Archers felt for the small windows between shields and found men there. The dust rose with a taste of copper. From the beach, the hulls looked like cattle sleeping, broad-backed, vulnerable, and remarkably flammable. A Trojan torch arced once and fell short. The hiss it made in the damp sand ran a cold finger down the Greek spine. The second torch did not fly. Hector lifted his hand, not out of mercy but out of discipline. He wanted a breach, not a feint. All that day men learned again the short vocabulary of war. Come, hold, strike, down, friend, water, mother, and the long grammar of suffering. Where Ajax stood, the line bent and did not break. Where Odysseus passed, a gap closed as foam closes behind a prow. Where Diomedes came on, the Trojans remembered to fear. But where Hector's crest nodded, a crimson flame above bronze, the field seemed simpler to Troy, and they advanced in the simplicity that unravels other men's complications. At dusk, when the air cooled enough to keep breath, the horns called men off the knife edge. Both armies stepped back as brawlers do when friends push between them. The Trojans camped closer than ever, their fires a new constellation a man could chart by. In the Greek camp, the pot simmered without appetite. Meat was chewed, because chewing tells the body it might live. Wine passed hand to hand, because hands need to feel other hands. The sentries took the rampart in pairs. In the quiet between cries, a name moved like a wind through the tents. Achilles. Some spoke it as accusation, some as prayer, some as the word for a key hanging behind a locked door. In his own pavilion, the man inside that name sat with his lyre across his knees and did not draw a sound from it. The strings held their breath the way he did. Patroclus, who had the gift of knowing when to speak and when to be a coat around a friend's weather, stood near the door and looked out. He saw the Trojan fires. He smelled the damp rope and tar of ships. He tasted the iron in the air that comes before a particular kind of storm. "If nothing changes," he said at last, and the rest of the sentence stayed in his mouth, because friendship sometimes knows to end a thought where hope can still live. Achilles answered after a time that had to be carried by two men. "The thing that was taken cannot be returned by gifts," he said. "He thinks honor is a purse he can refill." He set the lyre aside gently, as if to spare it from hearing him. "Let them learn how light they have made the world without me." Beyond the leather walls of that tent, sleep came like a careful thief. It took the old first, because the old are lightest. It took the young next, because the young surrender easily to the promise of morning. It took kings last, because kings do the worst sums after dark. Agamemnon woke often, certain someone had spoken his name. When at last he slept, he dreamed of his house in Argos, and in the dream he was a child again, and a hand, he never saw whose, took a toy from him and put it on a high shelf he could not reach. He woke with a bitterness that had no language and called it command. On Olympus, Hera counted the hours of Zeus's promise as a creditor counts coins that have not yet been paid. Athena turned the same plan in her hands until its edges cooled, waiting for the appointed moment to spend it. Poseidon walked the floor of the sea and measured with an old mason's eye the rampart the Greeks had thrown up, the trench they had carved in his shore. He shook his head the way craftsmen do at amateur work performed under pressure and without plumb. Before dawn, a thin mist laid itself over the plain. Men spit to clear the taste of it and found their mouths still full of yesterday's dust. The Trojans yoked again, bolder for having slept near their enemy. The Greeks drew lots for the dangerous posts, and no hand shook because hands learn not to before faces do. When the first spear flew, it made the small, familiar sound of a thing returning to its nature. Through the morning, the line swayed like two great animals testing one another's weight. A ladder appeared at the ditch, and with it the particular madness that climbs. Ajax heaved the ladder back with 3 men on it. 2 fell outward with the broken rungs, and 1 inward onto the Greek side, where a spear found him as surely as if it had had his name. Odysseus marked the men who faltered, and set others in their place, and told none of them he had already counted them dead in his private arithmetic if Achilles did not come. Diomedes, wounded in the thigh by a fortunate arrow, fought on with a grim economy, saving his breath for the next minute and the next and the next. Near midday, Hector himself reached the ditch, where the ground fell away in a treacherous step. He stood a moment with the spear butt set like a pilgrim's staff and looked at the ships, long, dark, patient animals waiting to be killed. He did not smile. He merely measured. Then he called for wood. Not for torches yet, for bridges. Poles were thrown, planks dragged, carts overturned into the gap. The ditch, which had been a mouth, became a throat. And the army of Troy set its weight to swallowing. News of this rolled back through the Greek camp like heat. Menelaus tightened his belt one more notch and did not know why he bothered. Agamemnon walked the line, did not speak, and for once earned more by silence than he could have by any arrangement of words. Nestor prayed without names. The old know the gods are not summoned more quickly by hearing themselves listed. The rampart groaned under the strain of bodies and will. And still Achilles did not come. Twilight gathered. The Trojans halted again, not from fear, but from the cool discipline that knows how to keep a victory from burning itself out. Fires were kindled so near the rampart that Greek sentries could smell the fat of roasting meat. A harp rang from the Trojan camp, bright and foreign, and memories rose in Greek eyes like smoke. Wedding feasts, boys' races, the noise of fountains in cities with no walls. Memory is a weapon with two edges. That night, it cut both ways. In the Myrmidon quarter, the men oiled their gear without comment, the way sailors coil ropes when the wind goes strange. Patroclus, folding a cloak with more care than cloth requires, felt the moment hook itself behind his ribs. He looked once more to Achilles and found him as before, sitting, seeing a far line only he could see. "Sleep if you can," Achilles said. And the quiet that followed did not mean permission. It meant he had already gone deeper into whatever place pride and pain share between them. So the first movement of the story ended, not with a trumpet or a treaty, but with two armies lying like exhausted beasts under a single indifferent sky, with a king hollowed by his own crown, with a prince measuring the distance between fire and wood, with a young man at a tent door listening for the sound of something he could not yet name, and with the best of the Achaeans seated in stillness, his lyre untuned, his wrath tuned too well. The plain held its breath. The sea kept breathing. Fate, who does not speak, turned the page. The sun rose upon the plain of Troy in a hard, white blaze that turned every helmet to a small, brief star. Bronze flashed as if the day itself were afire, and the dust began to lift before a single spear was thrown, as though the earth knew what was coming and breathed first. From the Dardanian gates poured the Trojans, chariots rattling, horses tossing foam, spears upright like a field of grain that had learned to glitter. At their head strode Hector, now a figure more than a man, helm crested, voice carrying low and steady across the plain. He did not shout promises. He lent out his courage by handfuls, and men who took it felt taller. In the distance, the black ships of the Achaeans lay in long rows on the sand, the masts a forest of bare winter trees, the ropes answering the sea's slow pulse with their own thin music. Among the Greeks, a silence of a different kind held. They had eaten, but the bread sat heavy. They had slept, but the sleep had not decided to help them. In every rank, there was an absence where a name should be, and the name was Achilles. The Myrmidon quarter was quiet. Tent flaps still, shields racked in orderly rows that meant no marching would be done from there today. Agamemnon moved along the line with his scepter, and men straightened because a king passed. but the straightening did not reach their eyes. Odysseus gathered stragglers and set them back as a mason sets stones. Ajax stood broad as a wall and let the younger men breathe in the shadow he made. Diomedes rolled his shoulders once, shook out his hands, and looked to the place in the air where Athena sometimes stands, as if expecting a nod he could not earn and yet would try to deserve. Zeus, in the high blue where winds are born, remembered Thetis's hands upon his knees and kept the scales gently tipped toward Troy. Hera's anger twined itself into the clouds and brightened their edges. Athena's gaze was a cool blade, but she waited. A god's waiting is a thing men feel only afterward, when they count the losses and see how the pattern made sense too late. On the field, heralds moved like slow birds, and the first bright spear at last left a hand and turned from a man into itself. The opening clash was two seas meeting. Chariots cut long lines through the dust and then vanished into it. Shields rang a thin, bright music that only war knows. The first cry rose, and with it the others, until the sound was a roof under which strangers become enemies. Arrows hissed above the front like insects angered from a hive. Here a horse screamed and sat down into its harness. There a man hit his knees and searched, for one lucid second, for a thing he had dropped years ago. The ground began to drink in a steady, unthirsty way, because this is the ground's old habit. Diomedes moved in that first storm like a man who remembers a path no one else can see. He did not rage. He chose. When a spear came, his shield met it with a dull acceptance, and his feet were already taking him to the man who had thought himself safe behind the throw. Twice he saved with the same motion: parry, pivot, strike. And both times the Trojans around him pressed back a step, as if to make room for what would be said later about that moment. A Dardanian prince, young yet already wearing his name as if it were a coat cut too narrow, drove at him with a cry that was mostly youth. Diomedes let the spear kiss his bronze and then put his blade where the cry had come from. The boy fell into a new, quiet membership with men who had done the same thing 1,000 years before him, and would do the same 1,000 after. Pandaros, the archer whose string was a rumor even when it slept, took a place on a small rise where the line had thinned. He licked his thumb and felt the wind, and remembered another day when he had loosed a shaft that began a different kind of fire. He drew until the bow spoke in that private way bows do, and the arrow went out like a sudden decision. It struck Diomedes at the shoulder, where the corselet closed, bit, and made him take a step as if the ground had risen. But the iron did not go deep. Blood came in a narrow ribbon. Pain made him clear. He said one word to himself, and it was not a god's name. Then he went forward again with the same economy. And Pandaros saw that some men are not undone by arrows so much as focused by them. Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, saw the turn in the field where Diomedes' work was changing the shape of courage. He set his jaw. He had a way of deciding without fuss, and called to the best of those near. They came because his call was the sound men prefer in a storm. He drove his chariot where the lines frayed and found Diomedes there, as he had intended. Bronze met bronze, and the air became a thin, small room with only 2 doors, through or back. Aeneas cast, Diomedes answered. Diomedes thrust, Aeneas turned with a neatness that later would be called grace. For account of heartbeats, it might have been a dance that had lost its music and kept its steps. Athena came then, not with trumpet or thunder, but as a pressure in the air, like weather about to change. She stood where Diomedes' eyes could not say they saw, and laid a finger on his helm. "You may know the gods today," she said, and that was both permission and warning. His sight sharpened, and in the bright he saw a boy's terror on a woman's face. Aphrodite, lifting the wounded Aeneas away in her arms. He moved to strike the goddess not as blasphemy but as habit, because the field allows only enemies and ghosts. His point found her wrist, and the pain she felt was delicate and enormous. She dropped her son with a cry that was more surprise than fear, and a mist came down between Diomedes and his purpose so suddenly that his next step came into emptiness. Apollo had arrived, cool as a spring under rock, and placed his hand on Diomedes' breast. "Not this," he said, and men felt that no one had spoken and accepted it anyway. On the Trojan left, Ajax made a room in the world where men could breathe. He moved forward like a cliff, deciding to approach the sea. Spears tapped his shield and lost interest. When he struck, he chose shoulders and wheel hubs, places where a line's meaning resides. Near him, Odysseus threaded between confusions and found the one thread that, when tugged, straightens a snarl. He did not kill more than most, but his killing made other men's lives longer, and so the day tilted by an inch it would not otherwise have found. Still, the favor of Zeus held Troy's side lightly upward. Where the Greeks gained, the ground under them softened. Where the Trojans faltered, a god's breath steadied the knee. Hector watched the texture of the fight, the way a shepherd watches weather, and sent his reserves not to glory, but to need. 3 times the Greeks pushed to reclaim the low ridge that looks toward the Scaean gate. 3 times they found themselves downhill, walking backward with shields high, because shields are doors you carry when the house is on fire. By noon, the heat had become a second enemy. Men fought as in a dream, where motion costs double. The trench before the ships glittered with the hazards men build for their enemies, and then must live beside. A team of Trojan horses shied at a shadow and plunged. A chariot's axle snapped like a dry reed. The driver rolled and rose and ran and lived because a friend's spear knew which back to threaten. On the Greek side, Nestor, who had long ago traded speed for foresight, called for water and for the cups to go first to the men who would not ask. His orders were the size of a man's mouthful, and because of that they could be obeyed. There came a lull in the mid-afternoon where the edges of things went soft. Both sides looked out from behind their shields and felt, for a small time, human. A fly settled on a helm and cleaned its hands as if this were a normal day. Somewhere, a lark insisted on its one song. The lull ended as such mercies do, without reason, with one man choosing action where another might have chosen breath. A Trojan darted at a gap and found it not a gap. A Greek pursued a retreat that had been drawn for him to chase. The knot closed again, tighter for having been loosened. Toward evening, the Trojans pressed hard upon the ditch. Hector ordered wood dragged and carts overturned to make a bridge, a thing that has only one dynasty. Now, the Greeks hurled stones so large that later men would stand where they fell and make the usual speeches. Javelins arced in parabolas that seemed, for a moment, to obey the same law that governs stars. The first cart wedged, the second flattened its own wheels, the third found purchase. And suddenly there was a way. The shout that rose from Troy was not triumph. It was relief made loud. Menelaus, who had learned to be brave in the dull, private way that does not shout its name, pulled back a handful of men and reset them at a narrow run between two stakes. "Here," he said. And because he said it with the voice that keeps geese flying in a V, they stayed. Diomedes came bleeding but unreadable and planted his feet beside them. Ajax stepped into the place where the blows were thickest and made a shelter like a spread cloak. For a space, no one moved except to move correctly. The ditch held. Night arrived not as mercy but as policy. The horns called the men away from the wire edge, and both sides obeyed with that peculiar, practical piety war teaches. Torches sprouted from the Trojan camp until the plain looked salted with fire. Closer to the beach, the Greek fires were fewer and lower. The flames kept small, as if flame itself were a thing that must be rationed. Food was chewed, because chewing agrees with life. Wine went around because hands needed to touch other hands and be told they were still attached to living men. In the Trojan lines, harps spoke and voices joined, the way a city reminds itself that it is more than a wall and a will. Boys listened to men reciting the deeds of the day and added, without knowing it, their first stones to the long road of memory. Priam walked the wall again and thanked softly whatever could hear him. Andromache, beside a sleeping child, lifted her hand once and rested it where a man's shoulder would be if he were not on the plain. In the Greek camp, sentries took the rampart 2 by 2. Odysseus counted the intervals as he passed and found them all smaller than he wanted. Nestor spoke with Agamemnon in the low, careful tones men use when pride has had a long day. "At first light," the old man said, "we raise earth and drive stakes. We build a trench with teeth. We are guests on this shore. Let us at least behave like guests who know how to set their tent against the wind." Agamemnon nodded because there was nothing else to do. The nod tasted of ash. And Achilles, somewhere very near and very far, sat in his quiet, his lyre within reach and untouching. Patroclus watched him without staring, a craft he had practiced since boyhood. He heard the distant clamor soften into the even breath of a huge, tired animal, and knew that tomorrow would borrow from today unless something changed. He folded a cloak he would not need tonight and set it where a hand in darkness could find it. So the war without Achilles laid its first long day at the feet of both armies. The ships slept like cattle on the dark shore. The city glowed like an ember kept under cupped hands. Between them lay the plain, rutted and promising more of itself. The gods looked down and did not declare an ending. Men closed their eyes and saw again the day behind their lids. Somewhere a wave found the same rock it had found 1,000 times and rehearsed the future. Morning came with a thin light that made the dew look like a quiet decision. In the Greek camp, men rose to work that did not glitter, hauling stakes, cutting sod, dragging timbers, shoveling earth. Nestor's counsel had taken root. The rampart grew out of the shore like a second dune, and before it, a trench opened its mouth, wide, irregular, hard to guess in depth. They set sharpened stakes within the ditch so it would bite at chariot wheels. They raised a palisade and lashed it with rawhide that smelled of salt and iron. Hammers ticked in the cool air, a music of survival. No one spoke of honor while they worked. They spoke of length and span, of rope and brace, of how a wall stands because men agree to stand together long enough to turn wood into will. Poseidon paced the long blue rooms of his kingdom and frowned. He loved a clean shoreline and men who built with permission. This wall would not last, he told himself. The sea would eat it in time. Yet he felt a craftsman's sting to see unpracticed hands lay a defense on his sand. He lifted his trident and held it steady, neither striking down their work nor blessing it. The sea rolled on, heavy and unreadable, as if to say that all walls are temporary, even the ones men carry inside their ribs. By noon, the palisade was a fact. Men rested a little, leaning on spear shafts, and for a few breaths the day felt like a day anywhere. Work done, bread to share, water cool in the mouth. Then the horns called, thin and insistent, and the Trojans unfurled again from the city, like a banner in a wind that had finally committed to a direction. Hector harnessed early and checked each strap himself. Discipline pleases gods and horses alike. Polydamas rode beside him and spoke in the tone of one who loves caution, not for its fear, but for its savings. Hector listened, because he was a man who listened. And then he did as courage required, because he was also the man they needed him to be. Zeus sat with his hand light upon the scale. Hera and Athena stood on the far side of thought, waiting for a crack in his purpose. None came. The high god sent a hawk sliding over the plain to mark his silence with a sign that meant only, "Keep faith with the last thing I said." The first Trojan chariot approached the trench and checked, as a horse does at the sudden shadow of a step it did not expect. The second turned inward and glanced away. Drivers leaned and talked to their teams with small, urgent words. Hector did not spur his horses at the trap. He called for planks and poles once more. Men ran with what they had. Carts were upended, lids of wagons thrown across the bight. The ditch gained a few careful mouths, bridged and bridled. The army found its teeth again and set them to the palisade. Atop the wall, Teucer the archer stood where a man could see far and be seen by fate. He had a habit of breathing twice before each shot. Once to join the world, once to leave it. He looped his bowstring across the small notch behind his ear and let the first shaft go. It hissed the way a true thing does and struck where a plume rose bright. The man beneath it sank without ceremony, as if agreeing. Teucer's second arrow reached for another crest and found the soft place below it. The third struck a rim of bronze and sang off into dust. He adjusted without thinking, as a candle adjusts to a draft. Ajax moved along the walkway with his shield high, the curve of it like a piece of sky brought down to earth. He praised men by name and corrected none. Men correct themselves when praised at the right time. Beside him, Odysseus marked weak boards and set heavier feet there, because the best way to keep a wall from failing is to step where it would have failed first. Farther down the line, Diomedes tied a strip of linen tight around his arm. No time for finesse, then took the stance he liked. Weight forward, shoulders easy, eyes searching not for glory, but for work. On the Trojan side, Sarpedon came with Lycian spearmen, his hair bound back with a simple thong, his face the plain face of a man who has decided. He touched the palisade with the butt of his spear as a carpenter tests a beam. He liked what he learned. "Not cedar," he said to Glaucus, and smiled because strong things are not always made of noble wood. He lifted his voice without heat. "Friends, the wall is a story the Greeks are telling. Let us offer an ending of our own," they pressed. Hands found purchase where none should be. The top rails shook as if remembering trees. Teucer picked Sarpedon from the crowd and sent a pair of shafts close enough to braid their shadows. But a Lycian shield lifted in time and took both with a sound like anger trapped in a box. Glaucus threw his javelin through a slit in the rail. The man beyond it folded, and the gap grew as gaps do when someone believes in them. Hector came up where the press was thickest. He did not waste breath on boasts. He set his shoulder to a gatepost and pushed. The wood groaned, the lashings squealed, the hinge debated whether to be loyal. A stone fell from Ajax's hand and found a chariot axle with the logic of gravity. The impact rang up the frame and into the driver's bones, and he let go of the reins as if they had bitten him. For a moment, the battle went bright and simple. Push, resist, lift, strike. Then the complexity returned, with its creeping side thoughts and oblique chances. The gate held, barely. The Trojans flowed along the wall like water seeking lower ground. A sudden cry went up toward the center. An eagle wheeled above the palisade, a serpent writhing in its talons. The bird struggled with its living burden, turned, and dropped the snake among the foremost Trojan ranks. The serpent struck once, more insult than wound. The men leaped back and shouted. Polydamas, his mind eager for messages, lifted his hand. "A sign," he said. "We have taken up more than we can carry, and it will fall back among us. Pull away from the wall. Wait for a cleaner hour." Hector heard him, and heard the men who did not want to hear him. Their spears tapping, their breath raw with almost. He weighed caution, not as a man insults it, but as a man uses it. Against the hunger he felt moving through the ranks, like wind. "If the sign is from Zeus," he answered, "it favors the hawk who has chosen brave prey. If it is from something less, let that lesser thing keep to its concern. We go on." He raised his spear, a gesture with the weight of an oath. The men surged as if the oath were theirs. Zeus listened to the exchange and did not smile. He sent a slope of cloud down over the Greek camp, a lid to keep the day's heat inside. Sweat stung eyes, hands slipped on leather, and the smell of men and wood and fear thickened into a single taste. From time to time thunder rolled far off. Not the explosion of storm, only the reminder that someone large was thinking. Teucer, relentless, pulled again and again. The bows curve a habit of his body. He reached for Hector, not for hatred but for geometry. The line, the arc, the space. His arrow flew true enough to earn its ending, but Zeus flicked 2 fingers of wind across the shaft. It rang off a helm rim and glanced away. Teucer did not curse. He sent another at the charioteer beside Hector and took him cleanly. The horses shied and dragged the empty car in a wild loop. Fate nudged, expressed itself differently, but still expressed itself. Down at the foot of the wall, Sarpedon's men found a seam where the rails met badly, where haste had left a kindness. They pried, the way a fisherman pries a stubborn lid from a jar too long closed. The seam snapped and opened like a mouth that had decided to speak. The Lycians poured into the gap and made a small room inside the Greek defense. Ajax reached that place almost at once. His shield filled the opening the way winter fills a door with snow. The men behind him pressed spears over his shoulder in a thicket that grew with each breath. Sarpedon laughed once, not for joy, but for recognition, and set his spear point upon the bronze. 2 opposing intentions met there and called themselves iron. For a long hour the battle was a narrow thing. Men fought at the distance of names. Odysseus dragged a fallen beam across a breach and pinned it with a stake he drove with his heel. Diomedes stepped into the pocket no one had claimed and made it his by working until the men around him forgot to despair. Teucer fell back to unstring and restring his bow, for sweat had turned his string to mud. When he returned, his first arrow took a man who had just begun to believe in a plan. Belief is mortal. At last the sun tilted enough that shadows grew honest again. The Trojans, who had learned in one long day's school how much a wall can cost, eased away from the palisade with the same care they had used to come near it. Hector called the halt, not because his want had lessened, but because he was steward to a greater want, the city's continuance. He gathered his captains with a glance. They counted spears, checked straps, walked their lines, and found, as men do at dusk, that they were still themselves. On the Greek side, the rampart stood, scarred, patched, slightly lower in places than it had been in the morning, but a fact still. Men sat down where they stood and let their backs learn how to be relieved. Water tasted like a miracle that had decided to remain. Bread softened in wine tasted like being allowed to continue. No one spoke of victory. They spoke of sleep as if it were a friend who might come, if treated gently. Night salted the plain with fires again. From Troy's camp came the sound of a harp, and, after it, a chorus of men's voices that carried a little longing even in their triumph. In the Greek lines, songs were softer and shorter. The words remembered wives, sons, the peculiar sound a door makes in a familiar house. Sentries walked the rampart 2 by 2, and when one stumbled, the other's hand was already there, not because of affection, but because of habit turned into care. High above, Hera and Athena drew nearer to the edge of their patience. Hera counted the lost and labeled each in a private ledger. Athena held a spear that existed only as a thought. "Not yet," Zeus said, not aloud, "and is not yet weighed as much as a mountain." He had given Thetis his nod. Until his purposes were satisfied, all other purposes were counsel without teeth. In the Myrmidon camp, where no torch guttered, Achilles sat in the wide quiet of his refusal. He ran his thumb once along a lyre string, and did not pluck it again. Patroclus lay upon a cloak and watched the roof's leather pale and darken as the fire beyond the tent's edge rose and fell. Tomorrow, he thought. Not a threat, not a promise. Only a word set on the threshold of sleep, like a cup of water. Outside, the sea breathed, keeping count for those who could not. So ended another day of the war without Achilles, with a wall still standing because men decided not to fall, with a city outside the wall believing more firmly in mourning, with gods in argument held by a higher quiet, and with the plain between them learning the shapes of new ruts it would remember. The ships lay like black cattle upon the shore. The towers kept their vigil, and somewhere in the dark a single wave rehearsed its old lesson against the same stone, patient as fate. Dawn came gray and thoughtful, as if the sky itself had spent the night deciding. A light wind worried the edges of the Greek banners and made the ropes sing their faint, salt-stiff song. From the Trojan side rose a low rumble, the sound of men putting on courage the way a craftsman puts on his apron. Not with fuss, but with hands that know their work. Hector spoke briefly to his captains, not promising wonders, only setting the measure of the day. Polydamas answered with cautions that fit among those measures like braces inside a frame. The army moved in one long breath toward the trench and the newly built wall that smelled of fresh-cut wood and rawhide. On Olympus, Zeus sat very still. His stillness was a lever that moved two nations. Hera counted hours in the corner of her mind, each tick a small defiance. Athena's eyes were level and far, like a surveyor who knows a whole plain by 3 fixed points. The nod Zeus had given to Thetis lingered like heat in stone. Everything that touched it warmed, and some of what warmed took fire. The first flights of arrows went up and came down with a neat arithmetic of return. The palisade received their tapping like a drum skin. Now and then a shaft found a seam and told its simple truth. Teucer stood again above the gate, drawing with the steadiness a man learns when steadiness has saved him more than luck. He placed arrows where plumes lifted, where bronze made a small sun at shoulder or brow, where a gap opened in the rhythm of shields. His bow's voice was the same voice it had yesterday. Quiet conviction, repeated. Below, Ajax moved in strides that taught the walkway to trust him. He lent his height to men who had been born shorter. He lent his calm to men who had eaten badly. Odysseus went where steps were crowded and conversation would be useless. He set shoulders and hands and boards into positions they could keep. Diomedes, with linen bound beneath his corselet, and the old neat way he had of choosing, stood where the gate's pressure was a story that must be edited each line. Hector did not throw the first torch. He asked for ladders, for hooks, for poles cut to just this length and no other. The Lycians under Sarpedon praised the accuracy of that length with their bodies. The palisade shuddered like a living thing learning a new pain. A plank broke, and the crack spread through men's faces before it reached their ears. Then the rails were propped again, and the crack was only a remembered sound. Around midday, a space opened in the swarm, the kind of breathing the battle takes to remind both sides that breath exists. The sun had grown blunt and high. The sea lay like hammered metal. From the Greek ranks came Machaon, the healer, with a small company, moving as a man moves who knows where his hands belong. He wrapped a torn forearm, set a shoulder, poured wine over a cut not because wine heals, but because it cleans. The wounded smiled at him with their eyes. He had the gift some men have for turning a corner of the world back toward order. In that same hour, the tide shifted and seemed to change its mind. A cunning arrow glanced from a shield and bit Machaon at the collar. The healer staggered, caught himself, and went on. But the news ran ahead of him. Nestor, wise in what must be saved, took Machaon into his chariot and drove him toward the ships with lines that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with time. As they passed the Myrmidon camp, the old man glanced that way and saw a door half open, a shadow that might have been Patroclus. Shadows are often the beginning of what a day intends. The Trojans pressed harder in the afternoon. Hector's chariot reached the lip of the ditch. The horses balked and then remembered that men had taught them trust. Bridging planks went down with a thud that turned air into wood. The gate quivered. The Greeks threw stones until their hands shook. They drove spears in angles that a teacher of geometry would have admired. They prayed without words because breath had other uses. 3 times Hector's spear found the same stubborn post and made it report its condition. Cracked, not broken. Bent, not done. 3 times Ajax leaned the weight of a whole reputation on that post and kept it in the world. In the city, Priam climbed the tower stairs with a care that belonged to both age and hope. He stood by the parapet, watching the balance of men tilt and steady, tilt and steady. Beside him, Hecuba spoke to the air in the old manner, saying the names of gods as if names were doors that might open. Andromache, at home, listened for distant rhythms. A pause that might be a messenger, a surge that might be a charge. The unbroken hum that means the man you love is still among the living throng and not yet the quiet. Late light stretched the plain. Sweat had turned dust to paste. Every grip on leather was a promise that slipped and was remade. Then a sudden cry traveled along the Greek line. Odysseus was down. Not dead, never the easy ending, but ringed, pressed, harried by spears that desired him. Menelaus ran toward that ring. Diomedes cut a door into it with 4 strokes. Ajax arrived and made a room which Odysseus could stand inside until his breath remembered its task. The hero of wiles spat dust, nodded once, and laughed a short, dry laugh the way a man laughs when the world has tried a trick he's seen before. He gestures small. Continue. By sunset, the palisade still stood, but the ships felt the nearness of flame as a cattle herd feels the nearness of wolves. Torches had not yet flown. Men had learned the cost of haste. The horns sounded truce, not as kindness, but as accounting. The field gave back its dead to both sides with the old ceremony. A walk, a lift, a sheet, a glance that stays with a man past sleep. Night laid its cool hand on bronze. In the Greek camp, cooks set kettles to a low, patient boil. Bread softened in wine. Armor was unbuckled with the small aches that come from fingers that have done too much of one thing. The leaders met in a circle inside a tent that smelled of leather and damp wool. Nestor spoke of watchfires, of double sentries, of sleep arranged in thirds. Menelaus suggested a survey of the bridges at first light. Ajax sat with his great hands quiet and listened, as if his breath could be lent to talk. Agamemnon watched the lamplight wrinkle across the gold of his cup and said little. Pride had become a silence he carried. When the council ended, men slept in their armor, swords within reach the way fathers keep water within reach for a child who will wake thirsty. The sentries walked 2 by 2 along the rampart and learned the comfort of another man's footfall matching one's own. But not all rest that night was sleep. Odysseus and Diomedes sat together with a small lamp turned low, the flame a thought that would not blow out. They spoke of numbers, not the glorious kinds, but the kinds that decide if dawn is survivable. Centuries counted, distances measured, the shape of the ditch in the dark, the places where carts had made new earth. A plan stepped quietly into the room. Go out, pull a thread from the Trojan loom, and see which pattern changes. Agamemnon gave leave. The 2 men chose their gear with the efficiency of habit. Light shields, helm rims padded so they would not sing when brushed, sandals wrapped to whisper. Athena laid a hand upon them that neither felt as touch. They went past the sleeping ranks, past the low talk of the last fires, past the place where the sea makes its soft instruction against the shore. The night beyond the ditch was bread dark and salt cool. A little wind traveled, and the grass heads nodded as if agreeing to something sensible. They found what such nights often provide, a man alone who wished to be brave while no one watched. Dolon, a Trojan scout with a wolf's pelt thrown across his shoulders and speed in his feet, came running wide of the ditch, glancing often at the ground as if the ground might answer him. Odysseus let him pass, then moved like a thought that notices. Diomedes took him gently first and firmly after. Words were exchanged in the small, calm manner of people who prefer meaning to noise. Dolon's courage turned to usefulness. He spoke of a newcomer's camp, a king from Thrace named Rhesus, whose horses were white as foam and faster than good sense, who had come late to glory as men sometimes do, and had lain down with his armor near and his care far. Promises were made. The kind men make who mean to keep none of them, because the world keeps few. Odysseus bound Dolon's hands with a neatness that would have pleased a sailor. He and Diomedes moved through the eastern dark where the Thracian banners slept. They went like water into a place that had counted only on air. Rhesus's men breathed the even breath of those who have not learned this country's way of sleeping. A tether line lay slack. The white horses turned their heads to look at nothing. Odysseus lifted bridles. Diomedes did the necessary work no song lingers on. When they led the horses out, the beasts walked as if of their own idea. The night kept their secret until it was their own to tell. Back through the grass shadow, past the quiet ditch, into the lamplight of their own camp they came, the horses bringing a clean, improbable brightness with them. Men woke to the sight as if morning had arrived early in a form they could touch. Odysseus smiled the small, private smile of a man who has relocated a problem. Diomedes wiped his blade as a craftsman wipes a tool, with respect, without romance. The gifts were set aside for later pride. The lesson was taken immediately. Some dangers can be unmade by going to them rather than waiting for them to arrive. Near the Myrmidon tents, Patroclus lifted his head at the murmured laughter and the sudden hush that follows surprise. He stood in his doorway until the sound settled into the even breathing of men returning to themselves. In the distance, Troy's fires burned with the calm intensity of a star that intends to go on. Patroclus lay down again and found that the night had put a small stone under his heart. A sign, perhaps, or simply the shape of what tomorrow would ask. High above, Zeus considered the balance he was keeping with 2 fingers. Hera and Athena drew a fraction nearer to their boundary of patience. The sea rehearsed its old sentence against the shore. The new wall stood, awkward, earnest, necessary. The ships slept close together as cattle do in bad weather. Between city and beach, the plain remembered every footprint and promised to remember more. So another day without Achilles closed its book. With the palisade scarred but present, with horses of impossible white tethered among the black ships, with a small advantage earned in darkness, and with a greater storm still knitting itself toward noon. Men turned on their sides and dreamed of places where war would not follow. Gods watched and did not agree. Fate, which does not need agreement, continued. Morning found the plain already busy with consequence. Word ran through the Trojan lines that Rhesus's white horses had vanished like a dream that refuses to be remembered. And with that word came anger sharp enough to be useful. Hector did not waste it. He let it travel. Let it heat the sinews of men who had slept too well on victory's edge. The Greeks steal in darkness, some muttered. And Hector answered without turning, "Then we will take in light." He lifted his spear, and the army's breath lifted with it. In the Greek camp, the small brightness carried home in the night did not add up to comfort. The walls stood, the horses stamped among the ships, but the day had its own arithmetic. Helmets were buckled by hands that had learned to tremble only after the strap was set. Men ate quickly and tasted little. Odysseus and Diomedes said almost nothing of what they had done. Such work is a message, and the day was now reading it. The first clash came early. Trojan chariots moved with a steady purpose, not the hot rush of boys in a race, but the measured pressure of men who intend to move a door from its hinges. Bows spoke from behind the palisade. The ditch took a few wheels and gave back groans. Stones thudded exactly where someone had told them to. Hector's voice arrived at the gate, the way a tide arrives. Again and again, and a little higher each time. Sarpedon's Lycians leaned where the timbers had split yesterday, and found the seam had been restitched. They put their shoulders to it without complaint. War is a craft learned by repetition. Zeus kept his hand over the day. Hera's patience thinned to a fine wire. Athena's spearlight gathered without being cast. Poseidon, counting the insults to his shore with an old mason's frown, stood a little closer to the Greek lines in the way a god can stand near without being seen. He loved ships and men who trusted planks, and though he had not been asked, affection is a kind of prayer. Near mid-morning, Agamemnon strode out to remind his captains he could still be a storm when a storm was needed. He swung his spear as if the last hour of a hunt were upon him. Men rallied to the sight, as men often do when a king remembers his use. 3 Trojan shields broke under the same thrust. A fourth held, and at once the returning stroke cut his forearm just above the greave. Blood quickened under the bronze and ran into his hand, until the scepter he once carried seemed the simpler tool. He gritted his teeth and fought on until breath told him the truth. Then he gave his wound to Machaon's apprentices and his place to Ajax, who took it with the uncomplicated assent of a man who has always known the next rock upriver would be his. Diomedes, who had slept with a pain tied under his arm like a quiet animal, found a surge of Trojans where the ditch narrowed. He met them the way a shield meets rain, accepting, deflecting, stepping. An arrow, glanced yesterday, found him clean today, traveling the small tunnel between bronze plates and biting meat. He swore once, without heat. Menelaus took his flank. 2 spearmen from Argos stepped into the space his breath had kept open. Diomedes walked backward with the calm of a craftsman sheathing a blade. "Bind tight," he said to the boy who took his weight. And the boy did, and learned where a knot is a prayer. Odysseus went down in that hour too, not felled, but ringed by the sudden rumor that he had. Trojans pressed to make the rumor true. He killed neatly, not much, just enough to make room for the truth to pass through. Still, a spearhead scored his ribs and left a line of heat he would remember later when counting debts. Ajax shouldered a path to him, more door than man, and Menelaus came behind, making certainty where there had been only intent. Odysseus nodded once, breath coming short, eyes already measuring the next necessary thing. Machaon, the healer, worked his miracles until a shaft answered his kindness with its own. Paris's bow, or some other precise hand, turned a small strip of air into pain at Machaon's shoulder. Nestor, who had long practice at saving what could be saved, hauled the healer into his chariot and drove for the ships. He passed the Myrmidon quarter with the reins taut and a prayer low in his throat. Patroclus, lifting a tent flap to the sea breeze, saw the old king's face streaked with effort and the healer's blood bright on the boards. He did not call out. He watched them go and felt a thread cast from their passage catch at the inside of his chest. News moves through an army like fire through dry grass. By noon, the Greek captains were all nicked or rapt or angry in the quiet way that bleeds into their words. Eurypylus limped but would not sit. Menelaus's hand shook only when it thought he wasn't looking. Ajax's shield had a new crescent bite where bronze had thought itself a moon. Pride does not bruise, but men do. The Trojans felt the softening and leaned. The wall held until the hour when shadows begin to have direction. Then Hector lifted a stone strange to the field. The kind cartwheels bring from riverbeds, and men remember with their backs. He set his feet, called to his body to make him honest, and swung. The stone struck the gatepost, where wood had been persuaded to forget it was wood. The lashings cried. The hinge decided it had loyalties elsewhere. Again, and the bar jumped like a hunted thing. Again, and the gate sighed the old sigh of trees in wind, and parted enough for purpose to enter. The breach was not broad, but courage does not require breadth. Trojans came like a stream at spring, first as separate threads, then as one. The Greeks met them with the reflex of men who have rehearsed disaster. Ajax filled the space as if he had been poured there. Spears grew in the gap like a hedge. Odysseus set a beam across two shattered posts and told it to remember being a door. Stones fell from the walkway, exactly where desperation points them when it has the strength left to point. Hector's crest shook in the gap like a live flame. Teucer drew on him twice, and Zeus made a small weather between shaft and target each time, so that bronze sang on bronze and fell harmless. Teucer changed his mind and took the charioteer. The car slewed and the horses screamed and dragged glory in a circle like a broken promise. Sarpedon's men found a second seam low to the left and made it into a mouth. Glaucus's spear came through and bit a shield rim, and then the arm behind it. In close quarters, the field loses its nouns and keeps only verbs: push, brace, turn, breathe. Smoke began to talk among the ships. Not fire, yet, but the idea of it. Pitchpots stood where men could reach them with shaking hands. Water pails waited like quiet friends who will not speak first. The hulls felt the press of bodies on the sand and the way cattle feel wolves near the flank of the herd. Agamemnon, bandaged and pale, walked with that cup of silence a wounded man carries. Half medicine, half shame. He said little. Sometimes leadership is the exact length of a look. In the city, Priam's hands shook on the parapet, and he did not pretend they did not. Hecuba named gods without rank. Andromache stood at a window where light fell across a small sleeping form, and she did not move it. She had learned not to wake peace when it visits. She listened to the vast, steady murmur from the plain and measured it against the rhythm she had learned to count for Hector's breathing when his helm was on. The two were not the same. She told herself the difference was distance and refused to translate her refusal. Late afternoon leaned toward decision. Hector called for torches, not to throw, not yet, but to be ready. The word fire passed from mouth to mouth and grew teeth and wings, as words do when they have waited too long to be spoken. The Greeks tightened their ranks so close that men felt each other's ribs move. Ajax lifted his shield once more and made shade for men who had forgotten the shape of shade. Odysseus forced a wedge of his own men into the line, where exhaustion had carved a small valley, and the valley filled. Patroclus, restless as a bird that senses a storm beyond the hill, walked to the rampart where the Myrmidons were not. He watched the fight hinge on a hinge and saw that the hinge would not last forever. He turned back, passed through the dark leather of Achilles' door, and stood. The man he loved like a second self sat with the same statue stillness that had now become a choice. For a long moment, Patroclus said nothing. Some requests require silence to clear their place before they arrive. "Friend," he said at last, and the word was the size of the world they had shared. "If you will not fight, lend me your armor and your men. Let the Trojans think you have come. Let fear remember its old path. We will drive them from the ships." No more than that, Achilles did not answer at once. He looked toward a line in the air that had nothing to do with sea or wall or city. When he spoke, his voice was even, as if he were measuring cloth. "My oath to myself stands," he said. "I do not fight for Agamemnon. But the ships are ours before they are his. Wear my armor. Take the Myrmidons. Drive them back from the fire. Then come away. Do not chase glory past the point where it turns into night." Patroclus bowed his head in assent that was also love. Outside, the light thinned to a lid of copper over the sea. Torches moved like low stars along the Trojan front. A single spark fell from a careless brand and died on damp sand. A second fell and lived a little longer. A third found the pitchpot's lip and whispered up a thin blue thread that men pretended not to see, because pretending buys time. The wall stood, altered and loyal. The ships breathed in the tide's slow measure. Above, the gods watched from their separate silences, while a plane, long in the making, stepped at last into the tent. So ended the day that taught both camps the exact price of going on without Achilles. A gate split to a hand's width. Kings bandaged and thinking in shorter sentences. Captains propped like beams that have begun to creak. And in the hush between two breaths, a friend asking to borrow a name. Night came down and made its careful inventory. The plain lay open as a book. Tomorrow had already written the first line. Night had folded itself away, retreating into the hollows of the earth and the silent depths of the sea. From the horizon rose dawn, the rosy-fingered daughter of the sky, stretching her light over the long plain of Troy. She laid a pale fire upon the black-hulled ships of the Achaeans, upon the half-broken wall they had raised in desperation, and upon the towers of Ilium that still held their ancient pride. The air was cool, salt-laden, heavy with the memory of smoke. Men stirred uneasily in their tents, for they knew this day would demand something more costly than the last. Within the great tent of Achilles, all was still. Yet the silence there was heavier than in any other place in the camp. The air smelled of hide and oil, of salt carried by the sea breeze through the seams of leather walls. The light filtered faintly, touching the polished armor that hung upon its racks, armor forged by divine hands and waiting for its master. Yet its master sat apart, silent, withdrawn from war. Achilles, swift-footed, best of the Achaeans, remained seated on a low bench, his head turned toward a distance no mortal eye could see. The wrath that had burned so furiously in him had hardened now into something colder, a silence that pressed close, as if fate itself had seated beside him. Patroclus stood across the tent, restless, his shadow moving upon the ground like a bird's wing across water. The hush between the two men was long and weighted, but at last it broke. First, Patroclus bent, tightening the strap of his sandal, an ordinary act heavy with resolve. Then he raised his eyes and spoke with the gravity of love. "My dearest friend, if you will not rise for Agamemnon, if your oath of pride binds you still, then let me go in your stead, not for empty honor, not to please the king, but for the ships, for the lives of our companions, for the men who whisper the names of their children in sleep, hoping to see them again. Give me your armor, that the Trojans may think Achilles has returned to the field. Fear will seize them, and we may drive them back from the fire. I will go only so far as to free the ships and then return. Lend me this gift, and let the day be saved." Achilles lifted his gaze at last and looked into the face of the man he loved like his own soul. His eyes were like still water, reflecting nothing yet holding everything. When he spoke, his voice was level, measured like a craftsman weighing a stone. "My vow stands. I will not fight for Agamemnon, nor will I forget his insult. But the ships are ours, before they are his, and I will not see them burned while I draw breath. Wear my armor, Patroclus, and lead the Myrmidons. Let the Trojans believe I have returned, and their courage will turn to dust. But hear me. Do not go too far. Be as the tide, advance, then withdraw. Take enough glory to quench the fire and no more. Beyond that boundary waits only darkness. If you push to the city's walls, night will find you long before sunset." Patroclus bowed his head, accepting both command and warning. In that gesture was obedience, but more than obedience. There was the deep, wordless loyalty that had bound him to Achilles from boyhood. They had grown together beneath the tutelage of Chiron, the wise, running wild on the slopes of Mount Pelion, learning to string the bow, to set broken bones, to mix herbs for healing and wounds alike. Those memories moved now in the silence between them. The laughter of children in the forest, the taste of spring water from a mountain stream, the sound of hooves pounding the ground in play. All of it had led here, to this moment heavy with destiny. Achilles rose. He went to the great bronze-bound chest where his armor lay, gifts from the immortal gods. When the lid lifted, the tent was filled with a glow, as though daylight itself had been caught and stored there. The boar-crested helm shone with a fierce, cruel light. The corselet, polished with oil, gleamed like the hide of some unearthly beast. And the shield, mighty, round, the work of Hephaestus, leaned against the wall like a captured planet, its surface alive with shapes and stories no mortal hand could craft. Piece by piece, Patroclus donned the armor. He drew the greaves over his shins, the bronze clasps biting into leather straps. He fastened the corselet tight across his chest, the weight of it pressing down, but also filling him with a strange power. He settled the helm upon his head. The horsehair plume nodded like a flame in the wind. Lastly, he took up the great shield, and when he lifted it, the light ran across its face in ripples, as if the sea itself had been caught there. To any who looked, Patroclus was Achilles. Outside, Automedon the charioteer stood ready, reins in hand. He yoked the immortal horses, Xanthus and Balius, shining like beings of air and fire, their manes tossing as if stirred by an unseen current. Beside them was Pedasus, the mortal horse taken in past spoils, humbler but steadfast, eager to run in the company of his shining companions. The bits clinked between their teeth, their hooves pawed the sand, and the chariot itself trembled as though longing to fly. Behind them gathered the Myrmidons, those fierce warriors kept too long from battle. They came rushing from their huts like wolves from the highlands, wolves whose bellies are filled with raw flesh and whose eyes still glitter with hunger. They clashed their spears against their shields, the sound a rolling thunder that carried to the sea. They cried out Achilles' name, thinking their lord had returned, and their hearts surged with the old fire. Patroclus climbed into the chariot, the armor blazing about him, and the Myrmidons roared in answer. He stood tall, a figure of glory and deception, wearing the likeness of the greatest of the Achaeans. Automedon cracked the reins, and the horses leapt forward, their hooves striking sparks from the sand. The chariot bounded, and behind it poured the host of the Myrmidons, rushing like a torrent released from a mountain dam. Bronze flashing, voices joined in a single thunderous cry. Achilles remained before his tent, watching. Pride swelled in him, for his friend shone like the very sun upon the field. Yet sorrow walked beside that pride, whispering that every sun moves toward evening. He raised his hand once in silent benediction. Patroclus, turning briefly, nodded in reply. Then the distance widened, the wheels spun, and the river of Myrmidons surged toward the smoke of burning ships, toward the Trojan ranks, toward the waiting mouth of fate. Like a storm breaking from the high mountains, the Myrmidons poured across the sand, bronze flashing, voices joined into one thunderous cry. The ground trembled beneath their rush, dust rose in curling banners behind them, mingling with the smoke of the burning ships. At their head stood Patroclus, armored in the likeness of Achilles. The plume of the helm tossed like fire in the wind, the great shield shone like a disk of the sun, and in every Trojan heart the same thought struck: Achilles has returned. The Trojans faltered. Men who had pressed so fiercely against the Greek rampart only a moment before now felt their courage loosen like a knot pulled too tight. Hector himself, turning in his chariot, saw the figure gleaming at the front of the Myrmidons, and for an instant felt the weight of doubt. The stories of Achilles' wrath, his speed, his pitiless bronze, flooded back into memory. Horses whinnied, chariots swerved. The tide that had run so hard toward the ships began to curl back. Then the clash came. Patroclus drove the point of his spear into the first Trojan who dared to stand, and the man fell like a tree under the axe, crashing to the ground with shield and helm ringing. The Myrmidons leapt over his body, striking, shouting, driving forward. Their spears found shoulders, throats, unguarded flanks. Shields slammed, blades rang, and the sound of it was like waves breaking endlessly on rock. Automedon steered the chariot through the melee, with the skill of a hawk weaving between branches. Xanthus and Balius surged, manes flying, their immortal strength carrying them like living thunderbolts. Pedasus, mortal but loyal, kept pace, his flanks dark with sweat, yet his stride unbroken. Wherever the chariot rolled, men fell. Wherever Patroclus' spear glinted, Trojans broke and scattered. The fire on the ships, kindled by Hector's torches, hissed and sputtered as Greeks rushed to beat it back. With the Myrmidons' onslaught, the flames were smothered. Buckets of seawater dashed across smoldering timbers, cloths beat down sparks until only smoke remained. A cheer rose from the Greeks, ragged but fierce. The cheer of men who had been one breath away from ruin and found themselves alive again. Patroclus pressed on, his heart swelling with the strength of victory. He was no longer only himself. Clad in the armor of Achilles, he seemed greater, brighter, a figure larger than the man he had been at dawn. The Trojans, struck by fear, gave way before him. Chariots turned and wheeled back toward the plain, riders urging their horses hard, dust billowing like storm clouds. Men leapt from their places at the wall and fled across the ditch, stumbling in haste, their spears dropped, their shields forgotten. The Myrmidons pursued, swift and merciless, their bronze flashing as they cut down those who lagged behind. They fell upon the Trojans like lions among a herd of cattle, scattering them, dragging down the weakest, roaring in triumph. The cries of the wounded mingled with the pounding of hooves, the grinding of wheels, the groan of men struck low. The plain of Troy, long accustomed to blood, drank deep again. Zeus watched from Olympus, seated upon his high throne. He had promised Thetis that the Trojans would triumph until the Greeks learned their need for Achilles. And so it had been. Yet now, seeing Patroclus drive the Trojans back, Zeus's heart stirred with conflict. He knew the fate woven for this man, that he would not return alive from battle once he stepped beyond the ships. The threads of destiny tightened in his hands, and though he pitied, he did not break them. Meanwhile, Patroclus's spear struck again and again. He slew Pyrechmes, leader of the Paeonians, his body falling backward into the Scamander's current. He cut down Areilycus as he leapt from his chariot. The man's skull split with a ringing crack. He speared Erymas through the flank so that the bronze point came out on the far side, and the man fell gasping, clawing at the dust. One after another they fell before him, until the ground was strewn with bodies like leaves after a storm. The Trojans cried out in despair. Some fled for the city gates, stumbling over one another in haste. Others tried to rally around Hector, but even his courage could not knit them together, while the figure of Achilles raged among them. He shouted orders, he wheeled his chariot, but his men were already breaking, already thinking of the walls behind them, of mothers and wives within the city. Patroclus, drunk with the heat of battle, urged them on. His voice rang above the chaos. Drive them! Drive them from the ships, from the trench, from the plain itself. Let them remember the name of Achilles. And the Myrmidons shouted in answer, their throats raw with fury and joy. Together they swept the Trojans back, across the trench, away from the rampart, and out upon the open plain. There the fight scattered into fragments, duels, sudden clashes, desperate flights. But always at the heart of it was Patroclus, gleaming, relentless, striking down man after man, his spear flashing, his chariot wheels spattered with blood. To every eye he was Achilles returned, and terror ran before him like a shadow too fast to escape. Thus ends that part of the Iliad, where grief deepens, and the shadow of vengeance rises. Achilles has not yet returned to battle, but the storm is near, waiting to break upon the plain of Troy. Thank you for journeying with us through this ancient song. Tell us, where in the world are you listening tonight? And would you like to hear the next chapter of Achilles' wrath and Hector's fate? Until then, may peace and memory guide your rest.